They did not shout, they did not throw chairs, they did not launch one last plea into the air of the Grand Hall, where species from across 3 galaxies gathered in their finest robes and gleaming exosuits. Instead, they rose as 179 human representatives from every Earth-born nation and every off-world colony, even the free-floating habitats of the Saturnian rings and the rough-cut cities of Mars. They stood in silence and filed out as a single line of resolve and fire, passing beneath the obsidian arches that had mocked them with every denied vote and every sidelong glance from cold-eyed technocrats who never quite stopped thinking of them as violent, unpredictable primitive. The council chamber had seen wars resolved and species exiled. It had endured coups and collapses, but never before had an entire member civilization simply walked away, not with anger, not with explosions, but with dignity and something more dangerous than rage, the quiet certainty of a people who had nothing left to prove. The silence that followed echoed louder than any declaration. It bounced off the gold leaf walls and crawled into the polished horns of the Thrin ambassadors. It wrapped around the clicking mandibles of the Varkay delegates, who had once joked that humans only existed to provide drama and blood, and now sat stunned as the humans refused to give them even that. It was not the vote that broke them, though the vote was cruel. The Council had denied human access to Tier 6 technology, and, despite Earth having reverse-engineered pieces of it on their own, it was not the constant surveillance or the endless debates where humanity was told to wait to evolve, to adapt, to be less emotional, less chaotic, less human. It was the look. The look that passed between the delegates from Earth and Luna and Titan and Europa and Ceres. The moment before the vote even happened, they knew it was coming. They had known for years. The Council would never accept them as equals, not because humans lacked intelligence or ambition, but because they refused to flatten themselves to fit into neat little categories like obedient species should. They had tried to play the game. They had sent poets and diplomat soldiers and scientists. They had rebuilt entire ecosystems on dying planets. And still they were called unstable. Still they were told to be patient, while the galaxy decided what to do with them. So they left. They walked out and did not turn back. Not one of them. No parting words, no exit speech, no threat, just the sound of their boots, their shoes, their magnetic soles clicking against the crystalline floor. And in that moment something ancient stirred in every species, present a strange unease, not rooted in fear, but in something older, the recognition of a force that could not be controlled, only partnered with or oppose, and the quiet realization that the humans had just chosen to become something the galaxy was not ready for. Independent, unbound, and utterly uninterested in asking for permission ever again. The Council called it a return to order. They said the debates ran smoother without humans interrupting with wild metaphors or emotional appeals. They said the chamber had regained its composure, now that no one was quoting ancient Earth philosophers or arguing that logic alone was not enough to govern billions of lives across 1,000 stars. They said the humans had been a disruption, an unpredictable variable in a machine that worked best when everyone followed the same quiet code. For a while it almost seemed true. Laws passed with clean efficiency, discussions stayed on schedule, and not a single voice rose above the polite tones of interstellar diplomacy. No more sudden laughter, no more shouting, no more unpredictable votes where a single human delegate might break ranks because of something they called a gut feeling. The Council resumed its great work. But something was missing, and no one said it out loud at first. At the edge of the Orion branches, trade slowed and complaints rose from merchant fleets about navigational errors and software drift. Colony supply chains began to lag, and even the automated agricultural systems on long-settled worlds started to fail without explanation. The Council responded with protocols and task forces and memos that spanned entire light cycles, but the problems persisted and spread and grew stranger. There had always been chaos in the outer systems, but with the humans gone, that chaos stopped being manageable because the humans had never treated it like a glitch to be patched. They treated it like a storm to be ridden and redirected and bent to their will, and they were good at it. They were frighteningly good at it. On stations where humans once served as troubleshooters and engineers, malfunctions lasted longer and sometimes never resolved, at all, as if the machines themselves resented their new operators. In the diplomatic corps, where human voices had once bridged centuries-old feuds with laughter and stories, and moments of raw shared pain, entire negotiations collapsed into silence and suspicion, because the humans had been the only ones willing to bleed for peace. And then came the uprisings. The first was a minor rebellion on a mining moon near the Helix Nebula. Nothing unusual on its own except for how fast it spread, and how fiercely the colonists fought, and how none of the old pacification protocols seemed to work. Because humans had trained them, had lived among them, had shown them that sometimes rules must break when survival is on the line. The council called it a fluke and sent a fleet. The fleet disappeared. No trace, no wreckage, no distress signal, just silence. After that came more rebellions, more silence. The council began to fracture behind closed doors, where the core species whispered about the void gap, and how maybe they had misunderstood the humans, maybe they had not been primitive, but simply new and evolving fast and impossible to predict. But by then it was too late to call them back. Messages were sent to Earth, to Mars, to Luna, and the outer colonies, but no reply came. The human systems had gone dark, no beacons, no broadcasts, just a growing wall of silence that stretched like a shadow across the stars. And still the council met and spoke in calm, measured voices, even as their edges unraveled, even as their peace began to rot from the outside, and even as they began to fear the silence more than they had ever feared the noise, even as they wondered what the humans were building in the dark, and whether it was already too late to stop it. Delcar Prime was a crown jewel of the Outer Rim, a planet of floating cities and vertical forests, a marvel of engineering and unity, where 9 species coexisted under a sky of drifting auroras. It was one of the last major colonies established with human help before the walkout, and it had flourished under that influence, growing not just stable but bold, alive, creative, unpredictable in the best ways. Humans had helped design the floating cities with platforms that adjusted to tectonic tension and weather patterns. They had trained the engineers to trust instinct as much as algorithm, had taught the children to question even the most accepted truths. They had planted seeds of resilience, and then they had left. When the threat appeared, no one knew where it came from. Not even the best scanning arrays could detect it in time. It came without a name, just a shape, a swarm, a flowing mass of biomechanical horror that dropped from orbit, without a signal, without a demand, without hesitation. At first the council believed it to be pirates or mercenary tech gone rogue, but Delcar Prime was not caught off guard. Its defense systems activated, its drones launched, its citizens moved into shelter without panic. Everything ran by the book. Until the book stopped working. The invaders adapted too fast. They changed formation between sensor sweeps. They infected drones mid-flight and repurposed them. They turned the very defense grid into a weapon against the cities. It was not conquest, it was consumption, and it was total. The council dispatched a fleet. The fleet arrived 30 hours too late. By then half of Delcar Prime had been turned into a storm of glass and ash and screaming static. And something worse had happened. The survivors refused evacuation. They broadcast a single message across the rim. You left us alone, now we are not alone. The council did not understand, because they did not remember the old stories, did not understand what the humans had taught the colonists about resistance, and about fire, and about becoming the monster when the monsters come. The remaining population of Delcar Prime initiated the Ember Protocol, an untested planetary defense routine designed with human advisors long ago. It was a last resort, a scorched earth strategy, meant to deny the enemy every victory, even the ruins. The planetary core destabilized. The swarm retreated. Delcar Prime did not survive. But it did not fall either. The council mourned publicly, issued condolences, privately reassigned blame, issued new safety protocols, none of which mattered in the shadow of the crater where Delcar Prime had once shone like a lighthouse in the dark. Something else changed that day, something the council could not quite name but felt growing in every report, every whisper from the frontier colonies, every message that ended in static. The humans had taught their allies how to fight. But more than that, they had taught them how to think, how to adapt, how to choose the moment when survival meant letting go of the rules. And those who had once depended on humans were not waiting for the Council to catch up anymore. The galaxy had started to move again. But not in the direction the Council wanted. And out in the black, where the stars thinned and the silence grew, a new shape began to emerge: ships without flags, weapons that defied known science, rescue operations that arrived before distress signals were even sent. They moved like ghosts. They hit like thunder. And they never spoke except to say, "This is not an invasion. This is a rescue." The first report came from a scout vessel drifting beyond the Vega corridor. Its transmission was brief, garbled, and laced with static, but the words were clear enough: unmarked ship, black hull, impossible readings. Then silence, no explosion, no mayday, just nothing. The Council dismissed it as a sensor malfunction. The outer regions were full of anomalies and accidents. Ships were lost all the time. But then came the second report, then the third, and then an entire trade convoy vanished between two settled systems, only to reappear 6 hours later in perfect formation, with all systems restored, all cargo intact, and every crew member claiming they had been boarded by shadows with human voices. The Council panicked quietly. Intelligence networks scrambled to compile data on the unknown vessels, which now numbered over a dozen, moving without pattern or warning, each arrival accompanied by the same pattern: a crisis, a catastrophe, a situation spiraling beyond control, then silence, then resolution. A failing orbital habitat was stabilized before Council aid arrived. A riot on a refugee station ended without casualties after an unregistered AI took control of local networks and began speaking in old Earth dialects. A prison break in the Grist Belt was contained by drones with no known manufacturer, marked only by a small insignia, a flame wrapped in the arms of a spiral galaxy. And then came the message. It was not transmitted through standard Council channels. It came as a viral string hidden in entertainment broadcasts and navigation data. It appeared on every screen at once, spoken in 100 languages, all with the same voice. This is not an invasion. This is a rescue. The Council convened an emergency session for the first time since the First Karn War. They debated fiercely behind sealed doors. Some called for force, some for diplomacy, some still insisted it was all a hoax or an illusion. But all of them were afraid, because deep down they recognized something in the voice. Humanity had returned, but it had not come back as the Council remembered. It had not come back asking for seats or treaties or recognition. It had come back changed. The ships were unlike anything in the Council archives, not because they were more powerful, though they were, or because they were faster, though they were, but because they moved with intention, not driven by orders or algorithms, but something else, something alive. They struck with precision, but never to destroy, only to contain, to protect, to intervene just long enough to stop catastrophe, and then they vanished, leaving behind no trace but silence. And the questions grew louder. Who were they? What did they want? Why now? But no answers came. Only more sightings, more recoveries, more quiet interventions in places the Council had forgotten or neglected or simply abandoned because they had assumed those lives were expendable. The border colonies began to change. They built new beacons, not to the Council but to the black ships. Some called them angels, others ghosts, others still used the old Earth word haven. And always the same message. This is not an invasion. This is a rescue. A cold panic began to set in among the core worlds, not because of violence or conquest, but because of something worse: the loss of control. And in that growing fear, one thought rose above all the rest. If these ghosts are truly human, then what have they become? And what will they do next? Because they are no longer asking. They are deciding. When the black ships first appeared, no one knew what to make of them, not even the Council experts who had once studied human military strategies or AI systems so advanced that they seemed to bend the laws of physics themselves. The ships were too silent, too fast, too precise to fit into any existing classifications. They did not speak at first, no signals, no messages, no demands, just a cold presence in the corners of every crisis. Humanity had once been known for its noise, its presence, its unrelenting drive to be seen and heard and felt. But now, in their absence, humanity had become something else, a shadow that moved through the fabric of the galaxy and fixed the fractures no one had known how to fix. The first to see them close were the scavenger fleets, the ones who searched the forgotten space between colonies, looking for what the Council had left behind. When the gates had closed behind them, what they found was both nothing and everything all at once. It wasn't a fleet, it was an order, a machine that moved with an intelligence not of logic, but of survival. It was a force of will, not just engineered but bred into existence for a single purpose, and that purpose was to stop decay, to stem the tide of collapse before it consumed everything. The first humans to board the ships were not soldiers, not officers, not generals. They were survivors. They were the ones who had walked away from the Council with nothing more than a strange vision in their minds and a feeling in their bones that they were meant for something greater than the rules they had been given. They were not part of any nation or empire. They had chosen to be free, not to conquer, but to protect and rebuild. And so they became the architects of the new order. Their bodies augmented, their minds sharpened by unknown technologies, something beyond the reach of any known species. Yet when they spoke with the ease of an old friend who had not been forgotten, but had simply stepped away for a while. They had learned how to think in ways the galaxy had not yet grasped, how to adapt to every new challenge without being overwhelmed by it. They had restructured themselves into something flexible, fluid, unstoppable without being reckless, and the results were undeniable. When the Haven Protocol responded to the growing chaos in the colonies, they did not meet force with force, but with something more radical, a complete reworking of everything the Council had believed about order and stability. They rewrote the rules of engagement. They reprogrammed the very AI systems that had been deemed too advanced for civilian use. They rebuilt infrastructures from the ground up and replaced outdated hierarchies with a new system that was decentralized yet connected. It was a system that worked not by enforcing rules, but by encouraging autonomy, with a guiding hand of wisdom that had been absent in the Council's calculated precision. The black ships arrived in waves, always just in time to intercept the inevitable moments of failure, the ones that made the Council's rigid system fall apart like a house of cards, and then they left as quietly as they came, leaving nothing but a solution in their wake, and a galaxy wondering if they had been saved or replaced. The Council could not admit they were losing control because they were not allowed to acknowledge that they had ever been in control in the first place. They could not understand how the humans had become this new force, not a singular race, but a collection of individuals who were simultaneously more and less than the sum of their parts. They had no loyalty to the Council, no allegiance to the established order, but they also had no intention of destroying it. They simply moved past it, carving a new path without permission. Somewhere in the quiet hum of Haven 1, the First Fleet Admiral of the new era watched the stars with a knowing smile, not because of victory, but because of something more profound, something the Council had never understood. They had built a system based on control and authority, but humanity had built something else, something that could never be replicated by any other species, something called trust. Trust in each other. Trust in their ability to adapt and survive together. And in that trust, humanity found a way forward that no one could predict, no one could stop. And the galaxy would have to learn to live with it or be left behind. When the Council finally reached out, the message was carefully crafted, precise and professional. It came through the most secure channels, sealed with the highest encryption protocols, a request for a summit to discuss the future of galactic relations and the possibility of reinstating humanity as a full member of the Galactic Council. The words were kind, but the tone was clear. They were asking not for peace, but for permission to return to the fold. They had miscalculated. Humanity did not need permission to survive or to thrive or to carve a place for themselves in the galaxy. They had already proven that by walking away and building something new, something beyond the reach of the Council and its stagnant systems. But the Council was desperate in their quiet panic. They thought that by asking for a seat at the table, they could somehow return the galaxy to the old order, to the old structure that had worked for so long, without ever truly understanding what had broken in the first place. The offer came to Haven 1, the human stronghold, now a gleaming metropolis suspended in the gravitational pull of a dead star, its surface alive with activity, the hum of countless minds working together toward a common goal, the goal that no one had ever truly understood except those who had chosen to build it. The delegation from the council arrived with all the usual fanfare, but when they stepped off their ships into the grand halls of Haven 1, they found no welcoming ceremony, no grand speeches, no fanfare, only a quiet hum of human industry. The only sounds were the soft clicks of boots on polished floors, the steady hum of energy flowing through conduits, and the occasional burst of laughter or quiet conversation. It was a stark contrast to the bustling noise of the council halls, where every word was weighed and measured with political intent. Here no one cared about status or titles or power. They simply worked together toward a shared vision. And so the council delegation stood in silence, waiting for their invitation to speak, but none came. The humans did not rush to offer seats at the table. Instead, they waited, allowing the council to stand in the center of the room alone for what felt like hours' time, bending in a way it had never done before, and the weight of that silence settled on them like a blanket, slowly suffocating all the words they had prepared. Then came the answer, not in the form of a speech or a declaration, but in the form of an action. A human leader stepped forward, not with pride or arrogance, but with calm confidence, the kind that only comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you stand for. The leader was no one special, just another face in the crowd, yet there was something about the way they stood that made the council delegation feel small. Without a word, the leader gestured to a screen above them, a simple black rectangle flickering to life, with the image of a single message. It was short, clear, and direct. You fear us because we are unpredictable, because we do not follow your rules, because we are driven by instincts that you do not understand, and yet we have given you every opportunity to lead yourself into the future, and you have failed. You have failed because you do not know how to evolve, because you have locked yourselves in a cage of your own making, and now the galaxy is starting to see what you never could. We are not here to join your council because we are already building a future without you. Humanity is not interested in your offer to return to the fold because we have already created something better. The screen flickered again, and another message appeared, this one even more direct. The future of the galaxy does not depend on your council, and it never did. You are not in control anymore. And if you want to learn how to adapt to a world that no longer bends to your will, we will show you, but only if you are willing to learn. The humans did not ask for their place at the table. They offered no seat for the council to claim. They did not want diplomacy or negotiation because they already had what they needed. They had a future that did not rely on the old ways of thinking, a future built on trust, not control. And in that silence, the council was left to face the truth, that they were no longer the architects of the galaxy's future. They were now simply passengers waiting to see where humanity would take them. The message had been clear and simple. Humanity was no longer asking for permission. They had been building something for centuries, and now the galaxy would have to either adapt or be left behind. The council had been silent for too long. They had held on to the old ways of control and regulation, as though the universe itself was something that could be contained, but they were not prepared for what humanity had become. The black ships continued their work without interruption. They arrived at stations at worlds on the brink of collapse, and they intervened not with the force of armies, but with the force of vision. They provided not just solutions, but the framework to create something new, and that was the true weapon humanity wielded in this new era. It was not technology, not firepower, but the ability to see past the limits of current thinking and see a better way. And yet there were those who still resisted, those who refused to believe that the old way was broken, those who held tightly to the council's doctrines and protocols, even as they began to unravel beneath the weight of their own failure. One of the largest rebel factions emerged from the Syndicate Coalition, a group of traitors and mercenaries who had long profited from the chaos in the outer colonies. They had always believed that the galaxy ran on power and trade and force of will, and they were not prepared to give up their dominion over the fringes without a fight. They saw the humans as a threat to their livelihood, And so they began to rally against them. With whatever they had left, they built armies from leftover ships and weapons, scavenged from the war-ravaged sectors. They launched surprise attacks and engaged in raids against colonies that had been transformed by the Haven Protocol. But humanity did not respond with retaliation. Instead, they allowed the Syndicate to make the first move. They watched from the black ships as the rebel fleets assembled and took position over one of the most vital trade hubs in the entire Rim. The Council had expected a declaration of war to follow, but that was not what they received. Instead, the humans launched a broadcast. It was simple, and yet it struck like a blow to the very heart of the Syndicate's beliefs. The humans did not fight, they offered. They offered peace. They offered a path forward not through destruction, but through transformation. The offer was not one of negotiation, it was one of revolution. It was an invitation to join a future not dictated by force, but by the possibility of cooperation and mutual growth, but not on the Council's terms or the Syndicate's terms, but on the terms of those willing to adapt and grow alongside humanity. The message was loud and clear. They had no interest in wars of attrition, no interest in building empires. Through bloodshed, they had already built something better. And when the Syndicate leaders received the transmission, they thought it was a trick. They dismissed it as a feint or an attempt to weaken their resolve, but the truth of it was undeniable. The human message was not weakness, it was strength. It was the kind of strength that does not need to shout to be heard. It was the kind of strength that does not need to hold others down to rise. And so when the battle for the trade hub began, it was not with the clash of ships or the roar of weapons. It was with a single simple decision made by the Syndicate leaders themselves. They could continue the fight, or they could lay down their arms and join a new world. Some chose war, but others chose peace. And in that moment, humanity's vision was realized not through the destruction of their enemies, but through their willingness to offer a future where they no longer needed to fight for survival, because they had already forged a way to thrive. The galaxy watched as the Syndicate withdrew their fleets in the face of the offer humanity had extended, and many of those who had fought on the side of the rebels now stood with them on the side of something greater, something beyond the old orders of war and conquest. And with every peaceful victory, humanity carved out a little more of their future, not by force, but by vision and trust, and the undeniable fact that they had learned how to rebuild what the galaxy had broken. The galaxy had shifted, but not in the way the Council had hoped. Their attempts to regain control had faltered like a dying star too far gone to reignite the rebellion. Had never been about overthrowing the old order, it had been about making space for something new, something that could not be controlled or limited by any one faction or any one set of rules. Humanity had not come to conquer or to rule, they had come to rebuild, and the people of the galaxy had seen it for what it was. They had seen the offering not as weakness, but as a way forward, a chance to break free from the cycles of violence and stagnation that had plagued their worlds for centuries. They had seen the humans not as invaders, but as liberators. And in the wake of the Syndicate's collapse, the ripple effect spread far and wide from the outer colonies to the core world's. Voices began to shift, no longer speaking of the old days of dominance and control, but of collaboration and trust, of shared futures, where each world had a say in its own destiny, but also in the destiny of all. At the heart of this new order stood Haven 1, the nexus of humanity's new vision. It was not a capital, it was a center, a hub not of power, but of possibility. It became the beating heart of a new way of thinking, where every species had a seat, not because they were granted one, but because they had earned it through participation, through contribution to the collective well-being of all. The black ships were not a symbol of domination. They were a symbol of unity, a reminder that the galaxy no longer needed to be governed by old laws or old fears, that the future was not something to be controlled, but something to be built together. The Council could no longer pretend that they were the voice of the galaxy. The people had spoken, and they had rejected the old ways. They had seen the promise of a new order, a better future, and they had embraced it with a courage that the Council had never expected. And as the black ships moved from system to system, they did not act as conquerors, but as guides, as partners in the rebuilding of a galaxy that had been shattered by centuries of conflict and mismanagement. They shared technology, not as a way to dominate, but as a way to empower. They helped solve crises, not by imposing order, but by allowing each world to find its own path forward. There were those who still resisted, but their numbers were dwindling with each passing cycle. The last holdouts of the old order, who refused to let go of their grip on power, refused to believe that a better way could exist. But even they began to see the change around them, and wonder if perhaps they had misjudged humanity, if perhaps they had been wrong all along. The final collapse of the council was not dramatic. There was no grand rebellion, no final battle fought in the empty halls of their chambers. Instead, it simply faded into silence, like the last echoes of an era long past. The leaders who had once made decisions behind closed doors now found themselves speaking to empty rooms and empty screens as the galaxy moved on without them. Humanity did not celebrate the fall of the council because it was not their victory. They did not take pride in the failure of the old systems because they had never seen the galaxy in terms of winners and losers. They had seen it as a living, breathing entity capable of growth, capable of healing, capable of moving forward. And so the new order began not with the flames of revolution, but with the quiet work of construction, the quiet rebuilding of trust, the quiet creation of a future where every voice mattered, not because it had been given a platform, but because it had earned its place through actions, not words. The galaxy was no longer ruled by fear or by the tyranny of tradition. It was guided by a new principle, one that humans had learned and now shared with others, that the future does not belong to those who seek to control it, but to those who seek to build it together. And in the silence that followed the fall of the council, humanity stood at the threshold of a new dawn, not as conquerors, not as saviors, but as partners in the endless possibility that lay ahead.